Yeah, I'm talking again. In my last lecture, I suggested some themes to watch for as you study African art. As you begin working on your presentations, I want to return to some of these works and practice one of the trickier skills you will need for the AP exam and, as it happens, for the Unit 5 exam as well, writing an attribution essay. Every AP Art History exam has one short essay, that is, one 15-minute essay, that asks a question like this one, which showed up in 2016. Before I show you the images that came with this question, let's look more closely at the question itself. The two key challenges right from the start are, 1, to figure out which of your required works is similar to the image you're given, and 2, to remember which culture produced that work. Sometimes, by the way, you will be asked to identify the artist or architect rather than the culture. This is much more likely to happen when the College Board chooses for its attribution essay a Western work by a well-known artist. So this was the image on the 2008 attribution shorter question from the old curriculum. Who's the artist and what is our required work? Think back to your summer work. You should get so lucky, right? But you probably won't, since the new curriculum started up with the 2016 test. For 2 years, the attribution questions required students to identify a culture. The 2018 test did feature an architect. In other words, these questions are getting harder. Back to the 2016 question. Here's the first image our students got, and here's the second. So you know this, right? What's the required work, and what is the culture? I assume you all got this one. Note that the scoring guidelines also cut students some slack, at least when it came to culture. Graders accepted ancient Rome or Roman as the culture, as well as Imperial Roman. I don't actually know how much leeway the graders gave on dates. That information isn't in the scoring guidelines, but note that you must identify the culture. That is required. There was a tougher element to this question. Students had to explain how the construction materials and building techniques accommodated the form or function of these structures. A lot of moving parts in that question. Students, however, could talk about arches, about concrete, about multiple entrances, about the velarium, lots of choices. So ancient Rome wasn't that bad, right? They wouldn't throw a work from one of those African or Pacific cultures with long, impossible to remember names, would they? Yes, they would, and that's what puts the E in ECB. An African art attribution question showed up on the 2017 exam, and by the way, students across the country pretty much bombed. So that's what we're going to practice today with some of our African works. One of the attributable works that you'll see in this podcast will show up on your unit exam. So take notes in your workbook now so you don't need to rewatch before the test. This is a work now displayed in the Seattle Art Museum. Which required work does it resemble, and which culture created that work? So here you see the two works side by side. Remember, on an exam, you will only get an image of the non-required work. You have to conjure up a mental picture of the required work from memory. But note that the new attribution work gives you a lot of help. So what formal similarities do you see? Remember, it is not cheating to use your eyes. We see hierarchical scale, the king is much bigger than everyone else, and richly adorned in coral bead jewelry. In both works, two attendants protect the oba's head with raised shields. The figures are frontal, with wide almond-shaped eyes and a straight, flattened nose. Smaller figures appear in the upper corners. Both works show evidence of trade with Portugal. The brass ingots to make these cast brass shields came from Portugal, as did the coral beads around the oba's neck and the horse the oba is riding. Moreover, we clearly see a Portuguese soldier to the right of the second oba. Just a side note, the oba plaques are cast brass, not cast bronze. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and bronze is an alloy consisting mainly of copper, combined most often with tin, but at times with other metals. Brass has a lower boiling point and it's more malleable. That means it's easier to shape. Bronze is harder, but it's also more brittle. The brass needed to make the plaques was usually transported in the form of large bracelets, manillas in Portuguese, and the quantities involved are staggering. In 1548, just one German merchant house agreed to provide Portugal with 432 tons of bronze manillas for the West African market. These plaques were cast during the 16th and 17th century and displayed in chronological order across the facade of the royal palace, and therefore they serve as a historical record of Oba kings. The plaques also offer a window into life in the Benin court shortly after Europe's first contact with West Africa. Portuguese traders sold Benin brass used to make these plaques, along with guns, horses, and the coral beads hanging around the king's neck. The Oba, or king, controlled the return trade in slaves, ivory, and other important goods, so that all the profit went to support his court and government. Here's an interesting observation from a BBC program about these plaques. They're not only supreme sculptures, but a reminder that in the 16th century, Europe and Africa were able to deal with each other on equal terms. Of course, relations did not remain equal. Do you remember from my first lecture how a British raid destroyed hundreds of years of history by pulling these plaques off the wall of the Oba's palace and piling them in a disordered heap which lost the chronology? So how about these two works? You only get one attribution work, by the way, though you might get different views of it. I just threw in another example for fun. So which required work is similar to this, and, this is harder, which culture does it represent? Yes, Ndop and maybe even portrait figure would be good enough, but Ndop is not exactly easy to remember, and neither is Kuba peoples. Unfortunately, just saying that a culture is from the Congo probably wouldn't do it, because we have 3 other works from what today is the Democratic Republic of Congo. What have you learned about Ndops, or portraits of leading figures, usually kings, from your reading? Like the Benin plaques that we just saw, this carved image preserved history for a people who did not yet have a written language. In the 16th century, the related ethnic groups that make up the Kuba peoples coalesced into a more unified kingdom under a single leader, or nyim. And like the Benin kings, the Kuba nyim employed artists whose main job was to record and glorify his reign. And here's an interesting similarity to some of our Egyptian works. Ndop were thought to be the site of the king's life force after death. More specifically, the Ndop supposedly housed the Nyim's double, the counterpart of his soul. If something happened to the king, say a wound in battle, supposedly this showed up on his Ndop. Ndops were kept in the king's shrine, and when the king was absent from the capital, the Ndop were rubbed with oil to preserve the essence of kingship at the center of the kingdom. So like many of our African works, this art had a performance element. I just talked a little bit about context, content, and function. What similarities do you observe in form? The Ndop portrait figures are all made of heavy hardwood, carefully oiled. The figures are highly stylized and not really individual. The canons of proportion were quite strict. The head, signifying the king's wisdom, must make up 1/3 of the statue. The figures have smooth, rounded features. They are frontal, that is, they always face front. They have almond-shaped, usually closed eyes, a flat, wide nose, full, relaxed lips, and a calm, gentle expression. The figure sits cross-legged on a square platform incised with geometric patterns. I was interested to read that the king chose his own patterns at his coronation. The right hand rests on one leg, while the other hand holds a now usually missing ceremonial knife. The king wears a protecting royal headdress. I'm going to stop there. You get the picture. In fact, you do get the picture of the attribution work, that is. If you can remember Ndop, which is not easy, you can get the visual evidence you need by describing the Ndop you have on your exam. And you only need to make a couple of these points. The more, of course, is always better. One other important shared feature of Ndop statues, the one I think could easily show up on a multiple choice question, is that in addition to a distinguishing geometric pattern, each king chooses an ebol, or individual signifier or symbol. So the strategy board game depicted on our attribution work is thought to symbolize the king's cleverness and skill in military strategy. I thought that was cool. The severed hand on a drum in our required work might mean that he's tough on his enemies, and it might mean that he has strength in his head as well as in his hand. What's important to remember is that Ndop statues on the one hand represent all Kuba kings, but on the other hand, each statue also represents an individual Kuba king who is distinguished not by his facial features, which tend to be uniform, but by his personal symbols. So what about these two fellows? Which required work do they resemble, and which culture produced them? This is another figure from what today is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I warned you, right? There wasn't a required context image for this work, but I found one anyway. So what if you just learned about the function, content, and context of this work? Art museum websites are a great source of information. The work on the left now lives with the Yale Art Gallery, and here's what the website says. A Nkisi Nkondi is a specific type of power figure in which the spirit was activated by hammering a nail into the figure. At the request of a victim of theft, for instance, a nail would be driven into the wooden figure, and the Nkisi Nkondi would also punish the thief. A Nkisi Nkondi also worked as a deterrent. Important agreements could be sealed in front of the figure, which would then punish all future violators of the agreement. The mirror of the abdominal box and the whites of these figures' eyes refer to the ability of the ritual specialist to pass between the worlds of the living and the dead through watery intermediary divides. The work on the right is now at the Brooklyn Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum website tells us that Nkisi Nkondi serves as a container for potent ingredients used in magic and medicine. You notice there were a number of questions about that. And in judicial and healing contexts as well. To make an Nkisi Nkondi, a carver begins by sculpting a human or animal figure with a cavity in the abdomen. Then a ritual expert completes the work by placing ingredients with supernatural powers on the object and in the cavity provided. He activates the figure by breathing into the cavity and immediately seals it off with the mirror. Again, a performance element. Nails and blades are driven into the figure either to affirm an oath or to destroy an evil force. So I'm going to let you do this one on your own. What shared formal characteristics do you see? In plain language, how do they look similar? Which required work and culture do these masks resemble? By the way, this was the work on the far left that showed up in the 2017 exam. Well, at least this work isn't from the Congo. So let's start with the easy stuff, formal similarities. Our required work is on the far left. These are idealized portraits. I don't think you could pick any of these people, usually women, from a crowd. But we see a number of common features. High foreheads, arched brows, heavy-lidded, downcast eyes, narrow, elongated, triangular noses, small, open mouths, stylized, elongated faces, ornamental extensions above the head, raised areas that indicate facial scarification. That is, scars that were usually an indicator of status, a textural and linear treatment of the hair. In other words, an emphasis on line. Once again, pictures are your friend. So how were these masks experienced in their original context? We actually know that our required and blow mask depicts the famous dancer Moya Yanso. The mask was commissioned by her husband. It was danced for many decades, first by Moya Yanso's husband and then by her sons. In keeping with tradition, Moya Yanso accompanied the mask when it was danced until she was no longer physically able to do so, and then her granddaughter assumed that role. But of course, we will not have that kind of information about an attributed work. What we do know is that Mblo masks were an idealized portrait of a specific individual who was respected within the village where he or she lived. The physical characteristics of the mask are idealized, but they reflect, of course, the culture's ideas of beauty. The work on the far right was auctioned by Sotheby's. Here's what the catalog says. Baule portrait masks were, quote, worn to enact a series of characters who danced to music with a participatory audience. The performance climaxes with the arrival of the Mblo in human form. The subject portrayed in and honored by a mask occasionally danced with it and addressed it affectionately as namesake, Ndoma. Last one. So here are two works, each with two separate views. What required work does this resemble, and what culture produced it? Note that this is another work from what today is Nigeria. In fact, we have three. The Oba plaque of the Kingdom of Benin, the Ikenga figure, which I'm not talking about today, but is Igbo, and this Yoruba veranda post. So you can't assume that Nigeria is going to be good enough for identification purposes. The photo is not a required image, but I think it's helpful. Note our required work on the far right. This photograph was taken in 1943 before the veranda was disassembled and the veranda posts were scattered in museums around the world. So what formal characteristics do these works have in common? Here's what the Metropolitan Museum of Art website says. This monumental work was one of a series of carved architectural supports designed for the exterior courtyard of a Yoruba palace. It was commissioned by a king from the most renowned master sculptor in the history of Yoruba art, Oluwe of Ise. Note how the posts are designed to show different figures in relationship to each other, and also to show them interacting. They employ both exaggerated proportions and a hierarchical scale. In the case of our required work, the senior wife is much larger than the junior wife, and even larger than the king. This signifies her important role as his advisor. In the attribution work, the king's importance is demonstrated by his position on horseback. So here's an analysis of the content and context from a book on African art. Compared to the queen, the king is quite small. Seated on his throne, his feet dangle in midair. By adjusting the scale of his figures, Olowe evokes two concepts. The first is the power of a Yoruba king is not in his physical stature, but in the mystical powers that he derives from his royal ancestors. These powers reside in the crown, which dominates the composition. The second concept Olowe evokes is the power of women. The imposing bird atop the crown concedes that the king relies on forces that women control. The large, physically imposing figure of the queen, painted a startling blue, also alludes to the supporting power of women. The king and all creation rely on the energies that women command. I think I like this culture. Okay, that's enough confusing information for one day. One of the works you've just seen will be the attribution work on your Unit 5 essay. Which one? It could be any of them. I'm using the random question feature on Canvas. The elves inside Canvas get to decide where you land on the Wheel of Fortune. But you need to know about all of these works for your test anyway, right? Hang in there.